Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
Good afternoon or good morning, Team Krulak community, and on behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Brute Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare, welcome back to the Brutecast, our series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. I'm your host, Major Ian Brown, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, the United States Marine Corps, or any other agency of the U.S. government. So the Brutecast audience knows that we've had several episodes this year in which we've asked the question, what will the next fight look like and what changes must be made in order to compete and win that fight? In the context of the institutional restructuring undertaken through Force Design 2030, these are very important questions. Today, we look at the problem through the lens of another topic we have often focused on the Brutecast, and that is wargaming. In May of 2022, the students of the School of Advanced Warfighting at Marine Corps University looked at the hard choices an institution must make to design a force capable of outperforming a committed adversary, and tested these choices in a series of open source wargames. And recently, the U.S. Naval Institute's Proceedings journal published 3 articles that highlighted these games and their outcomes. Lieutenant Colonel Brian Kerg and Major Tyler Quinn, both part of the student cadre that ran these games, as well as contributors to the articles, are here today to talk about what they learned and how those lessons apply to the challenges that Force Design 2030 is trying to face. So first guest, we have Lieutenant Colonel Brian Kerg. He's a Marine Corps communications officer who began his career as an enlisted mortarman and saw gunner. He is a Team Krulak non-resident fellow and a military fellow with the College of William and Mary's Project for International Peace and Security. He has written on Marine Corps and national security issues in a number of forums. And we also have Major Tyler Quinn, United States Marine Corps, who's an operational planner at Training Command. He is a military police officer with operational experience in all 3 Marine Expeditionary Forces. He's also a Team Krulak plank holder, having contributed to the first volume of the award-winning PME graphic novel series, Destination Unknown, as well as numerous other publications. So, gentlemen, it's great to have both of you with us today, and we're always happy to have another global Brutecast episode where we have people dialing in from all corners of creation. So, great to have you both here, and I'll turn it over to you to get our discussion and presentation going.
Thank you very much, Ian. Appreciate you having us. And so just to level set with the audience as far as the agenda today, I'd offer that we start with an overall summary of what the project was, and then discuss the origins of the articles that were written, and finally walk the dog by discussing each article in turn. So I'm going to lead us off by providing the scene setter and the context for the audience. I'm going to pass the mic over to Tyler, and he's going to discuss the OPT that thankfully he was the OPT leader of. So he was the lead designer and leader of that game. So he's very well positioned to discuss it in detail. I'll discuss one of the other games designed primarily by the OPT leader, Major Ryan Hamilton, and then I'll kick it back over to Tyler to discuss the third game that was primarily designed and led by Lieutenant Colonel Caleb Reed. So all that said, what is the Agile series and what were these articles? Ian, as you alluded to already, in May of 2022, our SAW class, our School of Advanced Warfighting class, we conducted a series of unclassified exercises and war games, the exercises feeding into the war games themselves. And those were called Agile Competition and Agile Response. Now, those games are intended to, as you alluded to already, explore the potential of 2 key elements of Force Design 2030, the concept for stand-in forces and the current prototype of the Marine Littoral Regiment. We made a point to deliberately use only publicly available or unclassified material. And there's an argument to be made that not using classified materials could limit the depths that the war games could explore. But despite this, we made several key findings that we propose remain useful to focus future testing, analysis, and discourse surrounding Force Design 2030. In addition to that, staying unclassified, it also allowed us to highlight 2 additional points. First, we could demonstrate the wider utility of unclassified wargaming to the national security community. So despite being unclassified, the methods that were used added rigor to the analysis surrounding the public debate of Force Design. Rigor you couldn't generate with just, prose and analysis alone, or just slinging yet another article into the ether, battling back and forth on the merits or not. Staying unclassified also, it allowed us to share the methods used so others can replicate them, right? Or build upon their own efforts. They could say, well, maybe I want to test this myself and see if this was in fact valid, or replicate it and then offer further validity to some of the findings. The second key point is that staying unclassified, it allows us to build, conduct, and share the game with allies and partners. So our class, some of the wargame designers in the class, participants, and the article writers included British, Norwegian, and Italian military officers. And so many of our partners and allies literally are the stand-in force, and they're critical to force design employment. So bringing them behind the curtain is essential for the utility of force design. So that's something you can't get by staying classified or going no form, right? Okay, so let me offer a little bit more context by briefly describing SAW. So these articles and these war games were generated by SAW, the School of Advanced Warfighting. A listener might be curious, like, what is that organization? So SAW, it is an advanced intermediate level school. So if intermediate level schools are command and staff college, SAW would be a second year advanced program building upon the first year of ILS. SAW and each of its sister service, not equivalent's not the right word, but similar schools, produce officers qualified to fill high impact service and joint planning billets in which they could develop operational plans or O plans or do service level initiatives like Tyler's doing at his current gig. So SAW specifically, it's offered at Marine Corps University in Quantico, Virginia. There's three primary tracks. You have operational art, joint planning, and future warfare. The general learning model involves a deep, intensive study of a series of related campaigns and operations, followed by a planning exercise based off of a historical counterfactual, and finally a war game where students fight their plans against one another. And then you wash, rinse, and repeat all year. Much of this is historically based. So one scenario was contemporary, and in this scenario that generated these articles, it was future based. So you get a lot of experience participating in war games, and in our school year, it culminated with the design and execution of a war game for the purposes we already discussed. So that's the scene setter. That is SAW, and that's how these war games and articles began. So now let's talk about the articles themselves and why I think it's significant to take the findings and make them more public through a forum like a professional journal. So as the end of the year approached, we were looking down the barrel of our academic year's culminating exercise, and that was going to be the Agile series, a 3-week-long interconnected series of planning and exercise with each week consisting of one phase of the event. During the first phase, participants conducted exercise Agile competition. So the students acted as either members of MAR4PAC, Marine Forces Pacific, an operational planning team with them, or a Chinese PLA Eastern Theater Command, OPT. So the MAR4PAC OPT, they were notionally chartered to develop a campaign concept to deter Chinese aggression and investigate how stand-in forces could be best used in competition with China through 2025. And the PLA OPT, they had to develop campaigning approaches to reunify Taiwan with mainland China. So that was phase one, that was week one. And in the second phase, participants transitioned to exercise Agile response. And students playing the role of MAR4PAC planners, they assumed the role of 3MEF, or 3 Marine Expeditionary Force planners, starting in the year 2025. So we've already fast forwarded in time. We're already time traveling, we're already in the future. Participants were required to develop a commander's estimate in the event competition escalated into crisis. And this commander's estimate was aimed at the 2028 to 30 timeframe and assumed that stand-in forces and the Marine Littoral Regiment will reach full operational capability, or FOC, by that time. The PLA team, in turn, they continued to plan from the Eastern Theater Command level to develop a plan to isolate Taiwan. Finally, the third phase, the meat of what we're going to talk about today, tasked all the participants to explore how the stand-in force maneuvers and is sustained in the littorals in support of a naval campaign in competition and during the transition to crisis within the specific analytical method of a student-developed war game using, again, only unclassified materials. While sticking to unclassified sources, again, it imposes some limitations. It also permitted the greatest transparency, and allowed for the widest dissemination of any findings generated by the war games, which leads to the decision to write. And I think a brief discussion here will also help other potential listeners or maybe future SAW classes or other folks at PME schools identify an approach or other things that they could build upon to develop their own collaborative writing approach to take what the hard work they do and put it in front of a public audience for greater discourse and debate. So as part of the final exercise, a writing team was appointed among the student body, not to write articles, but to write the reports for each OPT that would inform the master report that would then be passed off to the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab for their use. There was one writer assigned to each team. I was fortunate enough to be tapped as one, and a writing team leader that was Lieutenant Colonel Pete Cohn, our class commander for the year. I give him an awful lot of credit in getting this thing moving. He was thinking along the same lines as far as like, let's get this in front of other people. Let's share this with the world. As in, hey, this is a golden opportunity to put our findings in a public space. So he approached me and say, hey, Brian, would you be interested in helping with that effort, both in writing and in facilitating publication? Ian, as you know, I'm a total nerd for writing, and Pete was aware of that, so he roped me in to and bet me to his will. So we sketched out some possible approaches. Pete then approached the soft faculty and kind of sought their blessing because you got a lot of stakeholders on this thing, right? We didn't want to just do it without their awareness. Two of those faculty members, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Roundtree and Dr. Ben Jensen, they agreed to facilitate that effort. They plan to write their own article for War on the Rocks to provide a level of top cover for us that would plant the public seed of this forthcoming project. And then they reached out to the Warfighting Lab to ensure the lab was supportive of the effort. So given that the Warfighting Lab was sponsoring the Wargaming, sending some of their staff to run software on our behalf, having their buy-in to the project would be useful and be just good for relations between the two organizations. So then the hard part began. Each of the members of the Wargame writing team consolidated the reports as the Wargame ended, and we had to turn those into actual articles that people could read with interest. It would be suitable for a professional journal, such as Proceedings, vice for an academic journal, or something that might just be a report that would reside on a shared drive somewhere, perhaps never referenced again. So we took an initial swing at a rough draft of each of the three articles from the reports, and that allowed us to create a common thematic structure with a single voice. Then we surveyed the class to see who else would want to participate in the project and build on that initial framework and really put meat on the bones of the skeleton we painfully constructed, and ultimately sign their name to the articles. A little over half the class volunteered to participate. Some serious editing began, especially from each of those like Tyler, who led the separate OPTs. And once we were comfortable with the product, shot them over to the Warfighting Lab for their review. They gave us some additional guidance, and finally they blessed off on that. Finally, we were cleared hot to publish. We approached Proceedings, and they bit. They were excited about it. The editors were very supportive and excited to publish these articles, and they released them in November to coincide with the Marine Corps themed issue of their journal that they released this year, or excuse me, that they release each month in November. So, of note, among those who were willing to sign on to the writing project were joint officers and international officers. We deliberately placed one international officer on the byline of each of the three articles to help reinforce the point that the unclassified approach allows for a much broader audience among our allies and partners. So we're grateful for everyone who did some heavy lifting on this, but they deserve a special thanks as securing permission to publish in foreign journals can create more hoops for those guys to have to jump through. So that's a lot of info right up front, but that covers the project summary and the genesis of the articles, which I hope offers some great context. So we'll pause there. Tyler, if I missed anything, please elaborate, or if you're ready to take it and just jump into to the OPT project you led, please take it that way as well.
Yeah, thanks for that great summary, Brian. And I could definitely appreciate, the early start to the workday out there in Okinawa, having lived that life quite recently. So what I'm sharing right now is an outbrief that we gave, and it's really just a graphic summarization of the articles. This OPT number 2 was the one that I led. A couple things that I want to hit up front is, where do you start in designing a war game? That's not something that is usually hit on in depth during military PME. This past year at Advanced ILS, we went into that many times, as Brian described, as Lieutenant Colonel Kerg described. So a couple of the books that I looked at, for those that are interested, The Art of Wargaming, Peter Parrott, and The Craft of Wargaming, which is a recent publication by the Naval Institute Press. Those both were very useful in terms of trying to figure out how exactly do you go from soup to nuts and start something from scratch, depending on what the question is and how you want to use the war game, because it all depends on what the outputs are that you're looking for. So an overall view of this support to the naval campaign was really looking at the transition from competition to crisis. So we focused on the competition phase and put limiting factors in. One of the things that we did was take a look at the different force packages that were offered, and then created a scenario that drove things towards a crisis event. And that's where usually there was a pause, put limiting factors on the players, red and blue. So their goal was to not escalate, it forced things to stay in a competition stage. The other thing about the operational warfighting system that we used, Assassin's Mace, is that it's dice roll. It is malleable, so we had some folks on the team. Major Eric Prentice was very experienced in this particular war game system, and he was instrumental in being able to bend the rules in a way that was, within the design of the game, and allowed us to make some changes that we didn't have to completely create a game from scratch. So that is an option as you're looking at, how this could be replicated. You can use existing board games and wargaming tools and then modify the rules slightly, as we've all probably done. When you're a kid growing up playing Monopoly, something isn't covered in the rule book, you kind of make the adjustments. So we did that. The other thing that I want to cover here is that this type of wargaming system does not lend itself to quantitative data. It is definitely more qualitative, and usually you would say these types of games are more useful for stress testing a staff or decision-making process. So the outputs might be something that you could say, you get more sets and reps, to use that phrase. But we found it useful to actually find some of these qualitative patterns that were recognized throughout that, and then they are potential to go into more qualitative games that were used in the other OPTs. That gets to the key takeaways. The virtual attrition, by that we mean, what are you getting your adversary to spend their resources on that is not going to affect you. So they have to spend additional dollars either trying to find, deter, or compete with you, and you spend less of your resources. Sensing is greater than shooting. We've seen that across all the OPTs, so I hit that very quickly, but it's going to be a consistent theme throughout. Military deception, tactical deception, all of these things are key and need to be taken into account early on in the planning and fully integrated. During competition, there's always that risk of escalation, and so that was a key factor that we took a look at. In terms of the way ahead, again, like I said, this is something that we looked at. You could create another war game. You could modify other war games that would look at building and then fighting a battle network. And by battle network, I mean the sensing layer, the decision layer, the effects layer, and then the network that ties all of that together, as well as the processing layer. So all of those things, in common vernacular, your C5 ISRT, or your multi-domain kill webs. The other thing that we could do is incorporate more joint allied and partner capabilities, concepts, and plans. So as Lieutenant Colonel Kerg mentioned earlier, doing it at an unclass level allows you much broader options to incorporate other allies and partners, joint forces, without having to worry too much about interoperability or classification issues and sharing. And then developing scenarios and injects that would note the timing and circumstances for escalation. So those are some things that, as a wargame developer, the next person that takes this on could even further develop those injects to either force escalation and then see what happens, or hold those in reserve. So that's a general overview and scheme of that OPT2. I don't want to go into too much detail because we have other things to cover, and the articles really cover a lot more detail of the different game mechanics and how we went about doing this. The last thing to keep hitting the theme is that doing this in an unclassed environment allows you to replicate. And I want to reiterate that at no time were we read in on any classified things. This was all Google and academic research, things that are available to pretty much anybody. So with that, I'll turn it over to Lieutenant Colonel Kerg to go over the assurance and deterrence in OPT1, and that I believe is the second article that we covered.
Awesome. Great stuff, Tyler. And really great segue as far as the design of your game, which was much more, like you said, dice rolling and qualitative in nature, which is very, very valuable. This game, the second game, did use a modeling and simulation software. So you got a little bit more quantitative data, but it combined a qualitative approach as well. So you can kind of see the mix and match as we move throughout the series here. So Article 2, which was led by OPT1, try not to get tripped up. It was discussed the deterrent war game, and that was led by Major Ryan Hamilton, who currently works at the Warfighting Lab. The objective for that war game was to explore how the MLR can provide a credible force to assure allies and contribute to deterring adversaries, which, okay, got it. That's a tall order. I can hear other war gamers in the audience asking, well, how do you measure deterrence? How do you measure someone's unwillingness to take action? How do you game that, right? It's tough to do, but trying is better than just throwing up your hands. And it was a task, so we had to do it. So also Ryan Hamilton, brilliant human being, and he came up with a very interesting approach. So to measure deterrence, Ryan's team effectively gamed out certain scenarios to determine what force packages offered combat credibility, and then using joint doctrine for deterrence, assessed whether that combat credibility would have deterred the red player. So what does that look like in the war game? I'm not going to go through the detailed mechanics, but I do want to discuss at least an inch deep so that the listeners kind of understand what was the logic behind, presuming that we could in fact measure deterrence. So with the scenario, generically, there's indications and warnings that PLA is about to conduct a cross-channel invasion of Taiwan, and in turn, U.S. and Japan, they positioned expeditionary advanced bases throughout the Ryukyus. The MLR mission was to interdict PLA Navy and Air Forces operating between Taiwan and the Ryukyus so that the joint force could establish a sea line of communication between Japan and Eastern Taiwan. Ryan's OPT, they were divided into teams, subdivided into further teams representing China, Japan, and the US. And then they developed orders that were programmed into a game system called Command Professional Edition. That's a computer-based simulation of joint combat. It's frequently used for modeling and simulation purposes. Command PE has been used, many times by the Warfighting Lab. It was notably used at Naval Services Games 2020 and in many other games. Again, a great modeling and simulation tool. So several sims were run each day using that tool. Modifications were made following each run, either changing blue capabilities or the scheme maneuver. So in the article, Ryan has a really great decision loop showing what happened. Like, hey, if we failed to meet combat credibility, we then modified the force or the scheme maneuver. Do it again. Did we achieve it? Yes or no? Hey, we've achieved combat credibility. You got a combat credible force. And that would include the degree of joint and coalition support needed for the MLR to achieve that combat credibility, which of course leads to the question, well, what is combat credibility? So within the game, it was defined as the ability of the MLR to inflict a mission kill on a PLAN surface combatant, specifically a destroyer, within the PLAN surface action group, or SAG. The thinking being that, hey, if you can kill a destroyer in a SAG, you can cripple the SAG, and that would have a significant effect on the decision-making of Red. So finally, using the results from each of those turns, deterrence was assessed. And again, it wasn't just like, yes, I was deterred. No, I wasn't. Hey, we got to put some faith in our joint doctrine, right? So these assessments were pulled from the joint operating concept for deterrence operations, or the JOCDO, using the 9 doctrinal ways of deterring listed in that document. Team members then defended the rationale for their assessments, rank ordered deterrence effects, and the assessments of each turn informed how the blue forces again changed throughout the game. So that should satisfy the listeners as far as looking for the mechanics of the game and understanding how we sought to define and assess deterrence. Perhaps a more general interest to your listeners will be this war game's findings. Some might seem to validate what we think of as conventional wisdom regarding deterrence in the scenario, but others provided more granularity on the employment of the MLR and probably helped contribute to the wider discussion on MLR, EABO, and force design. So that said, I'm just going to touch on a couple of the findings. So first, combat credibility was tied to coalition support. Within the game, again, the ability to get a mission kill on a enemy surface combatant, that was achieved if the MLR maintained some coalition force support. So two factors contribute to that, notably the MLR requiring sensing and intel data from coalition resources, and the employment of long-range unmanned surface vessels to penetrate the defensive network of the enemy surface action group. Now, you might say, like, is that the be-all, end-all? Is that exactly what you need to achieve that? Certainly not. The game, it only had 1 week to run, and the game did not explore the many other joint options that could have offered perhaps similar capabilities or other coalition capabilities. And it's not a stretch to imagine a scenario in which the MLR sought to maintain minimal signature within Allied territory, so it might necessarily need to lean on those. I guess at this point, it's also worth underscoring that these findings are not definitive. This is not exactly predictive of anything, but provides insights for further research, because every war game is limited. So just take that with you as we move forward. Second finding, to be effective, the fire should be multi-domain and tightly coupled in time and space. So in general, like the naval strike missile, right? We tie that to the MLR. It had sufficient range to meet the targets, but the range does not always allow for coordinated effects with other fire platforms. So connecting those to other platforms that would have that would approach and impact the target at different points in time, compel the enemy to make decisions as far as its defensive capabilities it employed, so on and so forth. So if you're tying multi-domain fires, sequencing them appropriately, you can penetrate a network you might not be able to if you're just relying on one fire's platform or one fire system. Finally, combining the MLR deployment with other deterrence and assurance mechanisms significantly enhanced the MLR's effectiveness. Again, not terribly surprising. No one championing the MLR sees it as a silver bullet, but the game shows it to be a very appropriate means by which to enable and amplify other deterrent effects. And of these, the following ways achieved deterrence or provided some level of assurance. Those were amongst those mechanisms described in that joint doctrine: forward presence, force protection, active and passive defense, and security cooperation. So that kind of sums up the second article, which is the deterrence and assurance war game. Tyler, if I missed anything, please amplify. And if not, I'll pass it over to you to finish up with the last war game.
Thanks. No, I don't have anything to add on that. I think it was a good segue. And so we'll wrap it up with the third OPT, which really focuses on sustainment. It has been a common topic across all force design, and not just the Marine Corps, but across all the services, especially as you're looking at the Indo-Pacific region. Logistics and contested logistics especially is a thorny topic, and something that's very difficult to get after. So the third OPT was led by Lieutenant Colonel Caleb Reed, who is also at the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab right now, doing his utilization tour following SAW. This was the second quantitative war game, and it used the same software as OPT1, and that was Command Professional Edition. So with the
Tyler?
heavy focus,
Yeah, sorry, we lost your audio right after, I think, Lieutenant Colonel Reed there. So could you just kind of quickly go back and summarize that part? It was right after you started.
Absolutely. Yeah, Lieutenant Colonel Reed is at Marine Corps Warfighting Lab right now, and this third OPT was the other quantitative war game using the same software of Command PE, or Command Professional Edition. So simulating operational level sustainment. Basically what they did was they took a Marine Littoral Regiment and a Marine Expeditionary Unit. The Marine Expeditionary Unit served as a lot of historical data of what the sustainment rates are across all classes of supply. And it ran and compared those two using a Monte Carlo evolution, using the software through a competition scenario and then a conflict. So mu in competition, MLR in competition, mu in conflict, MLR in conflict. Again, based around the same area in the East China Sea, Indo-Pacific region, a similar scenario that set the standard scenario. Both the Mu and MLR had the same start, and using the Monte Carlo, you're able to get a randomized effect data input. So every day they were able to run those in the background and then compare them and do the analysis on the back end. So you can see in the slide a lot of bog stats, a bunch of guys sitting around a table to try to discern all of the data and how it was, what it meant. So at the end, the major objective was to find out what the cost to operate was. Major findings that came from that, and I'll cover those briefly, was in conflict, the Mu was more cost effective to sustain, roughly by a factor of 2, which doesn't seem like a lot, but when you're getting into the billions of dollars, it can add up pretty quickly. The cost imposition was marginally more combat effective. The MLR was marginally more combat effective than the Mu when you look at cost imposition. In competition, the MLR was more cost effective to sustain. So really, what's the difference there? And one of the major things that they looked at, that this OPT looked at, was if an MLR is part of that stand-in force in competition, they don't have the same level of naval transportation as a Mu does, but they are already in place. So in competition, they're a little bit more cost effective. In crisis, the Mu is already operational. You can maneuver it around, and it's much more cost effective because you don't have to use additional assets to support it. So you can see that there's an opportunity there for further research, further war games, to take a closer look at maybe what the transition would look like, or how a stand-in force is used, and how a Mu, a traditional Marine Expeditionary Unit, supports competition or is held in reserve as operational reserve, things like that. There's a lot of options there and a lot of rich ground to cover for future war games and research. Some of the other things that are common and won't be surprises to logistics discussions were the naval fuel budgeting and the littoral amphibious warship program. The fuel cost forecasting is difficult. Pre-staging heavy and oversized parts, building Iron Mountains, reduces ground maintenance costs. So there's a huge assumption made in terms of access and placement for the MLR that isn't made for the Mu. So that kind of speaks to that first finding of the Mu being more cost effective in crisis. And if you're not going to build the Iron Mountains, you can use contracting, support, and those types of things. This war game didn't get into a lot of those other options, but you can see how other war games, again, or research projects could dive deeper into those specific options. And then the embarkation, debarkation, and travel costs remain hidden. That's another area of opportunity for further research. So I put up the OPT slides just to kind of give an overview. It gives a little bit of a visualization as we talked through some of the major points from the articles, and really want to just continue to hit the creative space that was available due to the unclassified nature of this, and also due to the staff kind of letting the students run a little bit free with how do you design a war game. Great collaborative effort by the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab in giving these research questions, and how you take a sponsor of a war game, what are they looking for, and then get a collaborative team together to figure out how can we use a war game to expand research. So there's different benefits and costs to different research methods. The wargaming method, you can see 2 quantitative and 1 qualitative method that were used, and combined together, there were some themes that were consistent across in those findings. And for somebody else who wants to go deeper into that or bring it up to a higher classification level, you've already laid the groundwork for someone to confirm or deny or provide further context to those things. So those are really the major things that I want to kind of hit and reiterate through this, because it was a really unique experience. And besides the fact that, if you've never designed a war game, even though we're using current systems that exist, we didn't make the pieces and the dice and the rules and things like that. It is intellectually taxing, but a great experience and a great collaborative experience. And the last thing I just want to hit is that last war game, Lieutenant Colonel Caleb Reed and that whole team. They did a great job. I only briefly hit on the wave tops and spoke about that because I didn't have as much experience, but the collaborative effort in writing, to Lieutenant Colonel Kerg's point earlier, he's a big writer. He's got a lot of momentum. I would say aspiring, but for those that are looking to get into writing or things like that, the collaborative way is the best way. You can really build a lot of momentum, bouncing ideas off each other, and that's not a major topic for that. We're talking about wargaming, right? But I think the writing aspect of it is important to hit. And there's a lot of people out there that are afraid to dip their toe into those publication waters. There's a lot of sharks swim in those waters. But if you go in with a swim buddy and you're going to have a better time. And that is what I will close with.
All right, great, gentlemen. First off, thank you very much for taking us through all of those. I mean, that was a lot of wargaming you both did at SAW, and those articles as well themselves are pretty detailed articles. So I think there's a really good summary of everything that was captured in both the games and the articles. So first off, I'm going to jump right off of what Tyler mentioned about a little bit of a sidebar, but writing as a collaborative thing. I will foot stomp and say that the Krulak Center is currently running our next writing contest, which in fact is collaborative sort of by design, because we're doing a crowdsourcing edition of the Destination Unknown graphic novel series, which Tyler's probably familiar with. And we are asking folks to basically build their teams and submit their stuff as part of the contest. So if you want to dive right in the deep end, we are actively looking for content for Volume 4 of Destination Unknown. So with that, my first question is not so much on the games themselves, but I'm curious about, or what response, if any, either of you two have gotten to the series of articles that you've written, and whether that's sort of thumbs up, great job, or sort of a more critical response, because among other things, we're talking about this in the context of Force Design 2030, and there's certainly been some critiques of force design in terms of especially the wargaming aspect that is fed into it. Now, I know this series of games is not tied into sort of the initial set of games that were done, to sort of tee up the first edition of force design back when General Berger took over. But, development of force design has continued to happen. Wargaming in terms of force design concepts has also continued to happen. We've done that at the Krulak Center, and the Agile series here you just did is sort of a continued iteration of looking at those things. So I'm just, from those articles, what response, if any, have either of you two gotten in terms of outcomes, conduct, or just general feedback?
Yeah, so I'll jump off first. So my primary mechanism as far as feedback is either people responding directly to us, stuff I've gotten from the Proceedings folks as far as they observe their analytics, and then just the comments underneath the articles themselves. And if you write a lot, how you measure that can be very difficult. Sometimes you might write something and you think it's like no impact, no idea, because you don't get direct feedback. But behind the curtain, you see, and you wouldn't know unless somebody told you that, like, hey, that generated like 10,000 hits on a website, right? So it's hard to assess that completely. But what have I seen? So if you go to the Proceedings website, of those three articles, I'd offer that the second article, the one that pertained to Major Ryan Hamilton's led war game with the deterrence, you see some very energetic response in that discussion, or excuse me, in the response to that article. And it's not pro or con so much as carrying on the discussion, which is, hey, effects met, you've achieved the effect you desire, you're generating the dialogue. And so if you take that and we presume that there's been much more discussion that isn't recorded in some way, shape, or form. I'm sure it's planted the seed in a lot of folks and has been utilized. I did get feedback from the Proceedings folks that when the first article hit, it was picked up on the CHINFO, the Chief of Information for the Navy's, their kind of daily readout. So that amplification definitely blew up a little bit, which is very good for us. And then as far as not the articles, but the wargaming reports that were used to generate the articles, again, those are hosted by the Warfighting Lab. Those went out in other means, and I've had people here out in 3MEF see the report initially. That led them to the articles, and that led them to come find me to have a follow-on discussion. So I would say the nature of the feedback has primarily been, inquisitive and curiosity and wanting to pull on threads that were initially pulled up in the article. So again, they're not like, you saw force design, or like, no, that's garbage. Like, the force design is not validated or tested at all by these war games, but really like, hey, this aspect was intriguing. I want to see if I can explore that in this, that, or another way. Tyler, I don't know if you got anything else on your end, or if you're seeing anything from your seat at training command.
I haven't seen anything different than that. I would just reiterate the discussions that were generated and looking at the comments, and I think I would take that as positive. So, like Lieutenant Colonel Kerg said, it's not positive in the sense of good job or negative in the sense of bad job, but it did what it was designed to do, which is generate more discussion. And unfortunately, I haven't seen anything else in terms of, did anybody at Command and Staff College pick up that article and maybe drive their research projects towards that? I think that might be a little bit longer time coming. But so far, pretty good responses in terms of generating deeper discussion and conversation.
Great. Thank you both. And, to that last point about internal MCU sort of pickup, we will do our best after this broadcast on our side, because this is going to go out and I'll link to those articles again. And maybe it chums the waters a little bit for some follow-on questions specifically about school research. So getting into some of the questions in the chat here now. First off, from Albert Lee, and this goes into sort of challenges of models used in wargaming, as well as some of the inherent, you accepting of an abstraction in wargamings. And so his question is, were there any, I guess, going back to sort of the replication of your work, were there any concerns that the different systems you use internal to the war games, and potentially other systems that might be applied to the same problem, but not using those particular war game platforms, concerns that it may not necessarily be as repeatable with, even if you start the setup, even if you had the same players, if you use a different system, you might have something different come out, if that makes sense.
Just in general terms of wargaming, that's always a concern. And I think you always have to set up at the front end, similar to, a scientific experiment. There's a method to this. It's not just to do it to have fun. You're using it almost like a research method, or an experiment to prove or disprove a hypothesis. So you have to start up front with what your assumptions are, what your limitations are in terms of, the limitations of what the game can and can't do. And then in terms of the repeatability, I think the games, especially using Command PE, were run enough times, and especially using the Monte Carlo option there, that if you continue repeating it, you may get different results, but I think it won't be wildly disparate. So I don't think there was much concern, because the games themselves weren't necessarily designed to answer those hypotheses directly, but to start shining a brighter light on a path towards answering that, if that makes sense. Because I think at an unclassed level, it's going to be a lot harder to actually come up with more definitive answers or inputs. And really what these games provided was an opportunity to go deeper and to test and repeat, if that makes sense. Hopefully that answers it. I'll turn it over if you got any further amplification there.
Yeah, certainly. So 100% everything Tyler just said. And I'd emphasize the fact that, that element of chance that could exist in a war game, and some of the difficulties and replicability across different platforms when you're saying going from a command PE as your method, more modeling in sim, compared to going to the operational warfare system, which you may argue, hey, with the dice rolls, it's kind of repeating the randomness of a command PE-like system. However, it's very difficult to run a week-long game with a bunch of humans rolling dice as compared to running the command PE, letting it go overnight, running sim after sim after sim, right? So that is something we had to accept as a fact that describes the nature of wargaming, which in turn led to the risk of the concerns that Mr. Albert Lee was raising in that question. And I think noting that and embracing that and using the wargaming as a tool for understanding versus one of just for predictability, which I think is a very high bar for any wargame to meet, is something we simply had to accept. That said, even if we change variables, even if it's like, hey, in this game, when we added name the aviation platform that then was part of the joint package that enabled the effect Blue was trying to achieve, you might see the underlying theme of when you invite multi-domain fires of this capability or that capacity, boom, now we're sinking ships that we couldn't sink before. And if you measure that across different platforms and you have the resource to do that, different game types of the more qualitative and quantitative, and you kind of see where all that intersection occurs, I think it's not so much of a concern as a net positive of the wargaming endeavor. So that is an inherent challenge. I'm sure, Ian, between yourself and Sebastian Bay, if you guys were given unlimited resources, you could solve that problem. Unfortunately, nobody has unlimited resources for wargaming. So here we are, and these are the limitations we simply had to accept and work.
Yeah, and I think everyone in the audience, at least those who've sort of listened to our past episodes or have some familiarity with wargame, understands that they're essentially limited. There are constraints on them, and you accept that the things that they can't do for you, while understanding the things that they can. And I'll tell you, if you ever gave Sebastian unlimited resources, you'd probably put years back on his lifespan, because he's done a tremendous amount himself with extremely limited resources. Although more is not always better, but that's a different story. So I want to get a couple more questions here. I'll pull another one from Albert here out of the chat, which actually goes into hitting back on that point of using open source information so that you could, one, bring more people to the table, but also allows you to distribute it more. And that's something that, at the Krulak Center, we're always, we try and operate at that level for exactly those reasons, because you get more of those, people's perspectives, and sharing knowledge more widely, we think, is valuable anyway. But going into, if you could go maybe expand a little bit on some of the sources, open source, databases or reports or what have you, that were used for depictions of capabilities on both sides. And, with the understanding that sometimes the things that come in the, the default version of the game are not necessarily, they're the best that a commercial computer programmer can do with what they know. But a commercial computer programmer with no military experience doesn't always translate the things that they research into a game mechanic or performance that, even at the open source level, models something in reality. So what, if any, other open sources do you use to sort of fill in the blanks to make the mechanics and the units inside the war games perform as accurately as you could in the open source realm?
Yeah, so I'll lead off. So as far as sources overall, Tyler already hit it before. Google is your friend. So what could that mean as far as assessing certain things? I would offer, as you're searching around, looking for things, the CRS, the Congressional Research Service, absolute invaluable resource there as far as getting information and getting succinct reports that show capabilities and limitations with citations and resources you can then pull on. So just like any research tool, you're just going down the rabbit hole looking for what you're seeking. But as far as a more granular one for like a wargaming result like you just described, so I'll offer from I think it was Ryan Hamilton's wargame when they were programming things in Command PE, and they're looking at, hey, what works for in terms of survivability of something on an EAB. So then you might say, okay, we're detected under these circumstances. Red is now firing at us. What is going to allow us to meet the bar of not getting destroyed? Okay, an open source thing. We don't have a TNR manual for, say, operators of Rogue Nemesis system right now. But we do have a TNR manual for a HIMARS system, which you could offer is somewhat analogous as far as what it's intended to achieve. And in that TNR manual, you have the displacement criteria, or the requirements under which that thing should be able to displace and how long it should take. So if you know through your Google Foo that it takes this missile X time to go from point A to point B, you reside at point B, and you know that your TNR standard says you should be able to displace in Y time. If Y time is less than X time, you can get out of the way and move before you get hit. So that would be just one example of how we might pull on those resources to augment or complement or refine some of the things that the default wargaming tools may say. Tyler, did you have any other things as you explored through Assassin's Main?
Yeah, so I would just double tap that one is finding proxies. So again, that gets to the first question of, how repeatable is it? But if you're in open source, you have to find the closest analogy you can, and using proxies, especially when you're looking at future capabilities. The other thing, RAND reports, Center for Naval Analysis studies, those are also useful in terms of how an adversary might employ their capabilities. So I know the question is more about the specific capabilities and the default game sets, but if you understand the how, you can make some modifications within a game like Command PE in terms of an operational concept or how something might be employed as a total system. So system destruction, system competition, that was something that we took a look at. And the other thing I would just say is a depth of research. We didn't just pick some folks and say, okay, you're red. It was all backed up through the rest of the year with one of the other parts of the curriculum in deeper research of different adversary, military thought, military theory, and operational concepts. So if you understand all those things, then the specifics of the capabilities of that platform, you can modify it slightly in terms of how it might be employed as a part of a whole, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does, and thank you both for running through that. So I got time for two more questions I'll ask, and then we'll close it out here just to make sure we're honoring everybody's time. One question I had in the course of the discussion here, and then another I got via email from somebody who couldn't join us live today, but I want to make sure I ask it. So first I'll ask my question, which is, as you were going back and talking through, I think it was the second game that was looking at, assessing deterrence and trying to find a way to sort of quantify it in a way that could be tested against in the game. Coming up with the, deterrence was essentially ability to do a mission kill on an enemy naval unit. I'm curious if there was any discussion of another metric of measuring deterrence inside the game system, or whether something as sort of ethereal as deterring a human from making a certain decision was something that was really challenging to come up with, and that was sort of like the best way to figure it out, because I would think it's a fair agreement that a way to challenge human behavior is if you think your thing is going to be destroyed and you and all of your your crew are going to die, that would be a deterrent because you don't want to go into that situation. I'm curious if sort of how that definition was arrived at, and if there were discussion of any other ways of measuring that.
Yeah, so I'll preface this by saying I was not a part of that team, and I can't speak with too much granularity as far as where the discussions went. But I can say wave tops, yes, hugely challenging. The question of deterrence was something that we grappled with throughout the entirety of the academic year. And then suddenly you're in the compression of like you have 1 week to develop this game and test the game. And so what could in fact achieve deterrence? So it did really root on what you already highlighted, Ian, as far as like, if you have the capability and the will to destroy my combat forces in a way that if we sink the ship, then the surface action group, like as a fighting formation, is no longer able to conduct all of its tasks, on top of the fact that a lot of people are going to die. That will change decision-making calculus to the extent of, if my campaign is premised on these things functioning and not being destroyed, then I'm not going to make an irrational decision. Now, granted, you could also then argue, well, lots of wars were started because people miscalculated, and miscalculation is almost inherent in many of these environments at various levels of war. All true. Unfortunately, big question. We already touched on how war games can be very limited, so we had to hone in on one. And so, yeah, we anchored on rational decision makers, not wanting to lose unnecessarily and not wanting to lose forces, significant forces, unnecessarily as a deterrent effect, undergirded by the things that enable that in the joint operating concept for deterrence operations.
Yeah,
Tyler,
if I could add on real quick. So again, caveat, not a member of that team, but something that was discussed throughout the academic year in terms of deterrence. And I think that specific OPT, it was very important in terms of the assurance of allies as a complementary to the deterrence of an adversary. So it wasn't taken as its own thing. So that measurement of how an MLR or how stand forces can assure allies was taken complementary to the deterrence calculation of it. And again, I think it's a time and a resources as most things are in terms of what you decide to measure, and that was a very discrete thing that is very measurable. But the discussions were there in terms of, like you talked about, Ian, is how you get a decision maker to make the decision that you want them to make. I want to close it with one thing on that, and it's deterrence is really important, especially if you look at history in terms of what you are allowing or trying to shape the person or entity that you're deterring. You want to allow them to see it. If you have a capability and it's not known, there's physically no way to deter if the other person doesn't know that you even have that capability. So I'm thinking of specifically in the Italian campaign, World War II, in Bizerte, as they're going up the Italian boot, the Allies did actually have chemical warfighting capabilities. The Axis did not know that. And so there's a whole thing. It's fresh in my mind because I'm going through Atkinson's books on this, but it's a good example of if you don't show your hand or at least a part of it, it kind of negates the deterrent effect that you're looking for. So close with that. I have one quick save round. I said Peter Parrott earlier, and it's Peter Perla, The Art of Wargaming. I can't let a wargaming podcast go by putting the wrong author and one of the big names in wargaming. So I had to make that quick correction. I appreciate the time.
Great. Yeah, no, appreciate the correction. Again, somewhere Sebastian just let out a sigh of relief that we got that name right. And I realized that was a kind of a hard question to throw at you because if you guys had 1 week to sort of gamify deterrence, right? If we could figure out what deterrence could actually be quantified as, we would have a whole different take on national security decision making. Because that'd be great if we could figure that out. All right. Last question, and this is the one I got via email here before we all got together, and it's sort of going back to partners and allies as well as some of the experimentation you can do in wargaming. But they were specifically asking whether any either allied or competitor seaplane capabilities or wing and ground effect vehicle capabilities were included as part of any of these game sets, and that's something we don't have, but it's something that both of those, allies, partners, as well competitors have different variants of, and they're potentially, especially in the theater that you're looking at for those games, they're great for getting logistics to places that the game can't otherwise get there, projecting forces over the horizon in ways that ships can't necessarily do it, or even some stuff like recovery of lost crew of ships or aircraft. So very kind of pretty specific question, but I'm just curious if that was looked at all in any of the games.
Yeah, briefly, a specific question. I'll give a very specific answer for the Sink It war game, which looked at, again, we discussed the PLA, the US, and the Japanese players. So I'll leave Red Forces aside, but just looking at some of the capabilities played from the JSDF team, they were provided with 2 Japanese destroyers, 1 Japanese frigate, 2 Japanese diesel power submarines, 2 of their F-15 squadrons, P3 section, and they operated EAB. So as we looked at that and as we started with blue capabilities starting here, hey, we did not get combat credibility, adding on more things, that definitely incorporated some of the Japanese specific named assets, understanding their capabilities, utilizing the methods we previously discussed, and then running that through command PE. So that was certainly a factor there. And Tyler, I'm not sure if you could provide more granularity on your own perspective.
Yeah, I know we're coming up against time. The short answer is no. Not the seaplane capabilities or a lot of allied capabilities in the OPT that I led, which used the operational warfighting system, or in the logistics look. It was really in terms of what the U.S. had by itself. I believe in the third article, which was also the third OPT, that was one of the key recommendations, is looking at what other options are for allies and partners in terms of their logistical capability. I know we gave the caveat at the beginning of these views don't reflect SMC DoD, and I'll reiterate that. Personally, I think we need to look a lot closer at seaplane stuff if we're looking in the Indo-Pacific, and the JSGF definitely have a pretty strong capability there. And it's something that the Marine Corps should probably take a closer look at, in my personal opinion, based on the outputs of this war game, especially.
Great. Thank you both for those answers. And yes, I know I think there's a small sub community, but very, very energetic, looking at those kinds of things, wing and ground effect, as well as seaplanes, because, US used to have them. We don't have them anymore. But looking back at this particular theater, there's some things they could do there. And if we're not going to get them in the immediate future, we need to look hard at how those allies and partners can possibly bring what they have to the table and fill that gap. Okay, so that's the last question I think we got time for. Before we depart the pattern here, any final comments from either of you two gentlemen you'd like to share?
Just thank you very much for having us. We really appreciate the opportunity to share the work of our SAW class and the articles that we collaborated on with this wider audience. So other than thank you, no other thoughts. Tyler.
Yeah, I'll hit that again. Thank you very much for the opportunity to kind of push the articles and proceedings. And you look at naval integration, there you go. Krulak Center, proceedings articles, PME, all working together, and hopefully just generating discussion. It is not about shining a light on us or our STAR class, but really just getting the discussion going out there, and just allowing us to be, myself and Lieutenant Colonel Kerg, to be kind of ambassadors for the class, because this is a huge team effort, and a lot of people that way smarter than myself working on this thing and helping out to make it happen. The last thing that I did want to say is just the capability of quantitative and qualitative games put together, where you can let a computer run a lot, but you got to get humans involved in the decision-making process, because you can run as many sets as you want on a Monte Carlo, but until you get a human in the loop making that weird decision that may or may not be rational. But the combination of those two things really opens up a lot of cool opportunities in wargaming. So I'll close with that. And again, just lots and lots of thanks, and good luck to Lieutenant Colonel Kerg. I know his workday is just starting out there in Okinawa.
All right. Well, again, thank you, gentlemen, both, for taking the time out of your evening and mornings here to come and join us. I think this was a great discussion. And like I said, we'll link all the articles in the show notes for this episode so that we can, push that out, hopefully, to a wider readership and maybe generate some additional discussion and questions. So thank you both. Thank you to everyone in our audience who joined us today. We do have another Brewcast hot on the heels of this one tomorrow afternoon. We welcome Dr. Megan J. Hennessy, who is Director of Teaching and Learning Center at Air University, and she's going to talk a little bit more about wargaming, but specifically how the Air Force uses the tool of wargaming in its programs at Air University. I'll also note we have another Down the Rabbit Hole on the Russia-Ukraine war brewing with our Russia SME, Dr. Yuval Weber, so make sure you're following us on social media to see when that episode posts. And as always, we depend on support and feedback from the Team Krulak community to constantly improve our offerings and reach a wider audience. So if you have feedback on this episode specifically, please take a moment to fill out the survey that will also be linked in the show notes to help us do better. And if you enjoyed this episode, also please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel on YouTube, or leave us a review on the podcast app of your choice. It truly does help us reach a wider audience. And it's this kind of content that we really want to use to get out, because it covers a lot of very contemporary, pertinent discussions going on, and it can just help better inform and better shape how we're looking at moving out on the whole Force Design 2030 challenge. So thank you again for your support, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.